Hello and welcome to The Future is Spoken, produced by the Digital Assistant Academy. This show accompanies the Digital Assistant Academy's course entitled Voice Interaction Design. What's the difference between a voice interface that will provide helpful tools while benefiting everyone involved and creating a tool that will leave people feeling left out, unheard, and helpless? How can we ensure that our tools don't accidentally exclude or disadvantage real people? In this episode, Renée Cummings, data activist in residence at the University of Virginia, speaks about ethics in voice design. What does it mean, and how can we consciously implement it in our work? Hello, and welcome to The Future is Spoken. Today we've got a very interesting episode for you. We are going to be talking about ethics in voice design with Renée Cummings. Renée Cummings is a criminologist, criminal psychologist, AI ethicist, data activist, urban technologist, and international consultant, specializing in urban AI, ethical AI adoption, diversity, equity, and inclusion in AI, and so much more. Hello, Renée. Welcome to The Future is Spoken.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for being here. And why don't we get started with you telling a little bit about yourself, who you are, what you do, and how did you get here? You definitely have had an interesting path.
Definitely. So I'm a criminologist and criminal psychologist, and I also specialize in therapeutic jurisprudence, which is the application of the law in a way that heals and rehabilitates and restores. So I've spent the last 15 years really training law enforcement in areas such as homicide prevention and reduction, homicide investigation, gun and gang violence reduction, working with juvenile justice and juvenile delinquency prevention, working with crimes against women, looking at things like sex crimes and investigating crimes just in general. Also bringing a forensic psychology perspective to that as a criminal psychologist, where I often look at the mind of the perpetrator, what are the background and foreground factors that affected the commissioning of a crime, and just looking at ways in which we can reduce crime and criminality in society, but also bringing a very therapeutic approach to understanding the perpetration of crime and looking at things like adverse childhood experiences and early exposure to violence and different sort of psychological and stress impacts that really influence the kind of trauma sometimes that people are experiencing that leads to a particular kind of behavior. I also worked in mental health for quite some time, working as a substance abuse therapist, working within addiction communities, and spending a lot of time in a therapeutic community, working with individuals who had to take this kind of treatment instead of taking jail time. So I've spent a lot of time in the criminal justice system. Before that, I was a journalist, and I had an extensive career in communications and working in public relations and publicity and government communications and media relations. Before that, I was also a broadcaster. So I really have a very diverse background, and I think the diversity of my background is what brought me into AI. I started to look at the risk assessment tools that were being used in the criminal justice system and how these algorithmic decision-making systems are really misbehaving when it came to the administration of justice, and how they were either over-predicting something like recidivism, the rate of reoffending, or if it was frustrating the due process. And I think that whole commitment to due process and duty of care and bringing really a hyper sense of due diligence to the kind of deployment strategies that were being developed and executed when it came to algorithms really had me thinking. And I decided that as a criminologist, I had to step forward and really speak to this, particularly when we started to look at technologies such as facial recognition and bringing these technologies into the criminal justice system. So right now I look really at big data policing, the influence of that, the kinds of challenges that the deployment of big data policing is having in underserved or high needs communities. And right now, my present role is data activist in residence at the University of Virginia School of Data Science, where I'm actually working on a tool that is supposed to build communities up and support the interface and interaction between community stakeholders and law enforcement. So I have a very diverse career when it comes to AI. I'm very passionate about about the ethical use of new and emerging technologies. And I just want to ensure that we understand the long-term impacts of technology, and we understand as a society our responsibility in providing those rigorous and robust ethical guardrails to ensure that we do no harm or do as little harm as we can when it comes to the application of any new and emerging technology, any data-driven technology on societal challenges.
Definitely, yeah. So it is an interesting path, and I can see, just in your voice, the passion for the topic that we're discussing today, which is ethics in voice design and ethical design. So I wanted to start with a broad sense of the term. What is ethical design?
Well, ethical design to me does not have a definition, but it starts with the fundamental of understanding what is good design and who is good design for. Is it good for one community, or is it good for all communities? And I think that is one of the ideas that I like to bring to the space. The other thing that we've got to think about when it comes to ethical design is the question of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and how those fit into the design that we're creating. One of the places that one of the spaces in which I operate would be design justice. And I look at design through the eyes of criminal justice and the ways in which we have designed prisons, or the ways in which we design facilities for juveniles, or the kind of ways we design public spaces. So when it comes to ethical design, you come with that premise that speaks to do no harm. And then you've got to look at things like transparency and accountability and explainability, and looking at things like non-discrimination and justice, and how these things play into your design. And I think it goes back to what I call the moral imagination and the ethical imagination and the design consciousness of a designer. And you've got to ask yourself, when you start to create, where are you coming from? When you start to create, what is in the subconscious? And I think if we start to understand the power that ethics plays, and we start to understand how critical diversity, equity, and inclusion are to the design process, I think that is a way to operationalize instead of just simply define.
That's a great answer. I fully agree. And why do ethics matter in voice design specifically?
Well, ethics matters in everything. When it comes to ethics, it matters. We have got to understand that voice design has a responsibility as well, because you've got to appreciate that as we live in society and we interact with each other, we must bring an ethical perspective to everything we do. In a friendship, you've got to be ethical. In a marriage, there are ethics. In a relationship between yourself and the academy, if you're in university, there's an ethical relationship there that looks at things like plagiarism and, how do you use content. So for us to exist as a society, and for us to have a really solid relationship with each other, we've got to come from a place of ethics. If you have a friend who's unethical, that friendship doesn't last. And that is why ethics is important. It really guides our relationships. And voice design is also a relationship. When it comes to voice, I always, and the name of this podcast speaks to the spoken word, and it speaks to the power of the spoken word, and it speaks to the power of voice. Voice has the ability to motivate, to inspire, but it also has the ability to harm and to disenfranchise. And you have got to understand that as a designer of voice technology. You have a role, and you also have a responsibility. And you have got to ensure in what you are designing that, one, it is culturally relevant, it is culturally appropriate, it embraces concepts such as diversity, equity, and inclusion, and it does no harm. In the sense of, for a long time I worked in mental health, and I worked with individuals with disabilities. And when you think of designing voice technology, and you think of a person with a speech impediment, how do those things correlate? How do you merge those two? If I take much longer to pronounce a word and I'm using a technology like Alexa, is that technology inclusive? Is that technology accessible to someone with a voice impediment? Or if someone is in a particular state of trauma, or if someone has been harmed and they bring more emotion to their voice, or if someone has a different life experience, because we know that voice represents age, Voice represents oftentimes gender. It can represent gender. Voice also represents our cultural experiences. Sometimes voice could represent something like education. So when we're thinking of designing tools, let's say for an HR purpose, for recruitment, for hiring, because of COVID-19, so much of the interface is now done via more and more video. So if you are designing a tool for hiring and it's not culturally diverse, or culturally, appropriate sometimes, you could be leaving certain candidates out. If someone doesn't have a solid command of the English language, if someone has a heavy accent, how are we denying these people access to resources or job opportunities? So we've got to think about all of those things when we're designing. So this is why an ethical perspective to voice design is so critical. And this is why every voice designer has got to understand the role that ethics plays in the design process and have got to understand how important diversity, equity, and inclusion are in that process, and understand that for many years there have been individuals and groups and communities who have been voiceless, who have been underrepresented and unrepresented, and who have not had that measure of visibility when it comes to having their voice being heard. So you don't want to create a technology that amplifies disenfranchising individuals. What you want to do with your technology is ensure that all voices are amplified, heard, respected, appreciated, celebrated.
Yeah, so just from the few examples and that explanation there, it's very clear and easy to see how vital and important ethics in voice design and considering that when designing a chatbot or a voice interface is, and it's something that definitely needs to be kept in mind at all times and at all phases of the development process. It's very clear to me at least to see that just from those few examples, imagining any other examples that might come from that idea or that answer that you just gave. So thank you for that.
Sure.
I wanted to move into a more specific discussion here. I was wondering if you could describe designing for sensitive conversations. What does that mean, and what does it entail?
Well, to me, we've got to look at what defines sensitive conversations. And one of the things we have seen, particularly when it comes to voice, is that when it comes to voice design, is that sometimes because of our cultural background, sometimes because of our own experiences and those cultural experiences, much is lost in translation. So what may be sensitive conversation to my boss in a conversation that I may be having, right? Maybe not sensitive conversation to someone else. So we've got to look at that. One of the things I think we've got to appreciate when it comes to sensitive conversation is what are the things that could harm? What are the words that could harm? What are the words that could impact? What are the words that could be used by bad actors? What are the words that could easily spiral into disinformation campaign, and how these things are used? I think one of the most critical aspect of voice technology is to get the meaning of sensitive conversation right before we start to delve into that. Because one of the things that we have seen, particularly with voice technology or talk to text, or sometimes talk to text revealing a particular conversation that might now be interpreted. Different cultures say different things that mean certain different things. If you were to look at, let's say, Africa or India or New Zealand or Australia, when you look at indigenous groups and when you look at diverse groups, they have sometimes many different dialects. When you look at intonation, right? Think about it, pronunciation, enunciation, all of these things change the meaning of a word depending on how I say it. I can say thank you. I can say thank you. And depending on how I say it, you know exactly the meaning behind it. So we've got to, understand, appreciate, and bring that level of diversity to that whole concept of what is sensitive conversation. But we've got to also appreciate the ethical approach, the do no harm, that whole concept of trust, that whole concept of fairness. We've got to appreciate those things as well.
Right, and that's very interesting. And I'm curious as well if what the if there's a difference or if it's a similar approach when it's a sensitive conversation or an inappropriate conversation. Is there a different approach, or is it kind of a similar kind of thing?
You know, so I'll say this to you. I guess given my background in journalism, I'm really always vigilant when it comes to things like censorship and what is deemed appropriate and what is deemed inappropriate. So we may say a conversation that focuses on a relationship or a conversational relationship between uh, let's say a community that may not be familiar to us, we may deem that to be inappropriate. But we certainly know which words represent violence because, or which word represents danger, or which word represent harm. So we've got to be so clinical in the ways in which we interpret so much of these things. One of the things, and I will say to you in criminal justice, that we have been seeing would be the application of AI tools to really deconstruct the language on Instagram between gang members before it moves from social media and ends up into a homicide on the street. So it has been used in those ways to really measure sentiment, which is important. But then again, some conversations may just be, a heated conversation that may not materialize into anything else. And this is one of the challenges that law enforcement actually faces at this moment. And agencies, you would appreciate like the FBI, particularly looking at things like child abuse and child sexual abuse and sex trafficking using the internet, which is considered probably the biggest hotspot of this moment. So when it comes to sensitive, when it comes to inappropriate, we need to monitor these things definitely. We need to have regulations in place. We need to have rules in place. We need to set standards. But we've also got to think about that whole question of censorship and really finding a balance in there that works for all of society.
Right. And then, so I'm curious, that just made me think of this. I'm curious in the case of a chatbot or a voice interface, when something like that would come up, is that an opportunity for education, or is it an opportunity to just kind of end? Is that where the chatbot, should the chatbot or the voice interface be designed to even understand or be a part of that conversation, or should it leave it be?
Well, I think what you're saying is if something comes up like that, do we end the chatbot or do we allow it to continue? No, these things are our learning experiences, and this is what helps us build. When we think of AI and the technology itself, it's a technology that constantly is learning. When we think of our own life experiences, we are constantly learning as well. There were things that we said that were inappropriate when we were toddlers. There were things we said as teenagers that were inappropriate. It didn't stop us from talking, did it? But it made us very vigilant and very conscious of the words we were using and the impact these words would have. And it made us rethink maybe our own lexicon or really restructure our vocabulary or know not when not to use particular words or when those words were inappropriate. So I think if we're teaching technology and technology is learning with us, when a mistake happens, it's for the organization or the developers to acknowledge a mistake was made. And then you want to refine that product and bring it out there, because I think, we're not always going to get technology right at that instant moment. So when we think about machine learning and AI and deep learning, it's about learning, but it's about correcting the mistakes. And also, it's about bringing that diverse perspective to the design phase so that you don't reach to the deployment stage and then find yourself in these kinds of situations.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. So just putting myself in the shoes of someone who's currently enrolled in the Digital Assistant Academy, what are some of the ethical issues in voice design that students should think through, and what should they be taking into account when designing for a chatbot or a voice interface?
Certainly, I think what students should look at again would be just understanding very broadly, but yet very granular in the same at the same time what ethics are about, particularly when it comes to technology. And to understand when it comes to technology, you're creating a legacy. And what you're going to create is going to have long-term socio-technical impacts on society. So you've got to be cognizant of that. You want to design something that is reflective of society. You want to design something that appreciates and celebrates the diversity of who we are, which means that your technology has got to be as inclusive as possible, which means that your technology has got to celebrate equity in its design, which means also that you have got to bring that very dynamic, multicultural approach to what you're doing. And multicultural is including abilities and disabilities. You've got to include that. You've got to appreciate how accents work, and you've got to understand the power of voice. You know, voice has the power to change the world. Some of the most memorable voices in the world, you know, we would know JFK, Dr. Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, you know, there have been voices, Dr. Maya Angelou, there have been Gloria Steinem, there have been voices that when we hear them, we know them. You know, and once we hear them, Samuel L. Jackson, once we hear them, we don't forget them. But understand always, you know, come from a place of, to me, I always speak, you know, I like to come from a place of compassionate computing, empathetic AI, human-centered AI, and understand always the many people in society at this moment who are voiceless. And think about ways in which your technology could only not provide a service, but could empower. You know, think about that. So it really is important to amplify, find ways to amplify those voices. Think of children with speech impediments, or children with disabilities, or an elderly person who got a stroke, or someone who's had a heart attack, who may need to use this critical piece of technology. But because of how you've paced it, or the voices that you've trained it on, or the accents that you've trained it on, you're denying someone who may need your design at a most critical moment the opportunity. Design things that save lives, enhance lives, celebrate the lives that we are, celebrate the beauty of voice. I mean, one voice, when we think about it, there are so many voices. Let's celebrate. Let's lift each other up with the ways in which we design.
I love that answer, and it comes back actually to a number of interviews and podcasts that we've done. Is that human-centric voice design is the center of almost every concept when it comes to voice design, and really what you're saying is make sure that you're considering the human-centric design, but making sure you're not forgetting that there are humans that are different than yourself, and making sure that they are all included in the design of whatever you're working on. And it brings me actually perfectly into the next question that I had, which is when it comes to these ethical conversations, some businesses might not take these into account, especially when they're first thinking about or implementing it. How would someone who is tasked at designing a voice interface or a chatbot, how would they manage the features that a business or user might want, but has some ethical repercussions?
Well, I think you've got to look at your organization. You've got to look at the organization that you are a part of. You've got to see whether or not your organization embraces an ethical culture, whether or not design and ethics are seen as something that could exist in the same home, or is it seen as something that confrontational. And you've also got to bring, I always say, when we are in that design space, it is really important for you to always bring a certain measure of intellectual confrontation, because once you start to break it down and look at how we're going to design this, and look at the strategies, you've got to bring an ethical approach, you've got to bring a diverse approach, and you've got to understand when you combine that ethical approach with a diverse approach, you're reducing risk. So you could approach the organization from a risk management perspective, saying that eventually along the life cycle, we are going to detect some risks. And if we don't detect it in the design phase, or don't highlight it in the design phase and find ways to mitigate it, then we reach the deployment of a product, and then we have a crisis, and then we have public backlash, then we lose public confidence, public trust in our organization is now being reduced, and then that whole question of legitimacy of our design is now being raised, and it's going to affect the bottom line much more if you deploy something that deploys a certain measure of risk, and something does not appreciate, diversity, or something that may be seen as biased or discriminatory. So it's easier to deal with it in the design phase. And also in that design phase, it is very important to ensure that among your designers, there is diversity. And diversity is not just putting a woman as opposed to a man, including a woman or a man. No, diversity is much more than that. You've got to look at stakeholder engagement from the design process, include stakeholders, include individuals with disabilities, include, individuals who may be diverse in other ways, sexually diverse when it comes to religion, when it comes to age. You've got to bring, because not one person uses a product, sometimes in a household. So you've got to bring that diversity to the design table. Don't wait for it to be deployed, and then impact the community in a negative way, and then you're spending an extraordinary amount of money as a business trying to repair reputational damage that has hit you at the bottom line.
Right. So it sounds like it's easier to deal with upfront rather than let it go through, because it's going to be exponentially worse for everybody, not just yourself and your business, but for the end user and probably the industry as a whole, if this doesn't get discussed in the design and implementation phase. So I was taking a look actually at your LinkedIn profile and a little bit of information about you, and something that looked interesting to me that I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit about was designing resilient solutions to urban challenges using AI. I was wondering, how can it be used to empower and sustainably transform cities and communities as well as organizations? Because that sounds very interesting to me.
Right. So when it comes to technology, you want something that's sustainable. And where there's sustainability, there must be resilience. And we have got to appreciate how communities, particularly communities of color, have been impacted just by the lack of resources. And one of the things that we're seeing when it comes to technology, again, would be the squeezing of resources when it comes to communities. We've got to appreciate, particularly in urban spaces, that how diverse it is. And one of the things that I try to encourage, even when it comes to design, how do we find ways to bring diversity into the industry? And when we bring that measure of diversity, then we are going to be designing things that could really be much more resilient and much more sustainable. So you've got to look at things like, how do we use data? How do we analyze data? How do we interpret data? How do we classify it? The annotation process. We've got to look at all of those things and how diversity impacts that, or the lack of diversity impacts that. What is lost in translation when data turns from knowledge, or when data turns from information to knowledge, or from information to intelligence? So it's really about bringing a much more intelligent approach to the ways in which we design to build things that are resilient, and to understand that we have got to create things that are culturally relevant and culturally appropriate, and look at sustainability issues like flooding, like climate change, like climate justice, like design justice, economic justice, environmental justice, algorithmic justice, and really having that broad appreciation for how these things impact the ways in which we co-design the future. And if we want to co-design in a way that is resilient, if we want to co-design in a way that is trauma-informed and understand the impact that technology and data could have on the stress levels of communities as well, and understand the importance of well-being when it comes to the use of technology, we're going to build things that are resilient and things that we can be proud of in the long run.
Right. And it's almost as if, well, it is as if that these tools and technologies are going to be a part of our future. So we might as well be working towards making them right now to fit into our communities of the future and as well as our communities currently. So I think that is a good place to kind of wrap it up a little bit here. Just before we go, I was wondering if there is anything that I didn't ask you about that you wanted to discuss or mention?
I'll just like to say that we've got to appreciate that the future is now. We're already using technologies. Our life is built on technology. Technology is now part of our bloodstream. It's very hard for some of us to even detach from the technology. Some of us have become addicted to the technology. So we have got to look at the many ways in which we have got to redefine the relationship that we are having with technology. We've got to look at ways to democratize the technology. We've got to look at ways to ensure that we don't further marginalize or disenfranchise any individual groups or communities with this technology. And we've got to be bold enough as designers. We've got to be bold enough as individuals working in new and emerging technologies, working in artificial intelligence, bold enough to do the right thing, bold enough to understand it is our own responsibility to educate ourselves on things like ethics. And we've got to bring a kind of ethical consciousness and ethical vigilance to the things that we do, because we want to ensure whatever we create, the legacy that we leave is a legacy that provides the kinds of resources we need as a society to continue to grow and develop positively, to include, not exclude, to really celebrate diversity. And just in everything you do, just ask yourself, how is my technology going to impact this world in a positive way? And when I've designed this, what is going to be my legacy? And I think if you answer that question, you're going to be on the right path. Thank you.
I agree 100%. And I think that's great advice for anybody in any field to take into account, especially in the Digital Assistant Academy for those who are planning on designing these technologies of the future. So thank you so much.
Thank
am
you.
so happy that you were here. And I think there's a lot of value for the Digital Assistant Academy students to find in this episode. So I really appreciate it. And I hope you have a great rest of your day.
And thank you again. Bye-bye. Take care.
Thanks for listening today. Remember, you can find all the information on how to become a certified voice interaction designer, along with show notes and more, at our website, digitalassistant.academy. That's digitalassistant.academy. We encourage your feedback and questions, so be sure to get in touch by using the contact page at the Digital Assistant Academy's website. We'll include the link in the show notes. In our next episode, Laura Rosenberg discusses inclusiveness and privacy in voice design.